The antiques in the collection were too perfect, too clean. Thomas Sterling had been working with antiques for 40 years, and he knew one thing. Real antiques are never this pristine. These pieces looked like they were made yesterday, but the most suspicious thing was that they all came from the same source, and that source had a very dark past. You see, Thomas wasn't just any antique appraiser. For 25 years, he had been the FBI's top art crimes investigator, tracking down stolen masterpieces and Nazi-looted treasures worth billions. He thought those days were behind him. He was wrong, because what he was about to discover in Margaret Ashford's basement would connect him to the largest art theft in history, a network of war criminals who had been hiding in plain sight for 80 years, and a secret that powerful people would kill to protect. Welcome to Echo Stories. Before we begin this incredible story, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Charleston, South Carolina. The historic district where antebellum mansions lined cobblestone streets, and old money families guarded their secrets as carefully as their heirlooms. Thomas Sterling, 67 years old, had been running Sterling Antique Appraisals for 15 years since his retirement from the FBI. His shop on King Street was modest, filled with carefully curated pieces, each with a story he could tell in detail. Most people saw Tom as a gentle, scholarly man who knew everything about 18th century furniture and Civil War memorabilia. What they didn't know was that before Charleston, he had spent a quarter-century as the FBI's lead art crimes investigator, tracking stolen Picassos through Swiss banks and recovering Nazi-looted Rembrandts from private collections. He had chosen Charleston specifically for its quiet charm. No international art dealers, no suspicious collectors, no late-night calls about stolen masterpieces. Just honest estate sales and wealthy retirees looking to authenticate their grandmother's china, until Margaret Ashford called. Margaret Ashford was Charleston old money. Her family had owned the mansion on East Bay Street for 6 generations, and at 89, she was the last of her line. With no children, she had decided to auction her late husband's extensive collection. "Mr. Sterling," she said over the phone, "my attorney recommended you. Heinrich's collection is substantial. European pieces mostly. He was quite the collector. Heinrich Ashford." Tom remembered the name vaguely. German immigrant who had made a fortune in shipping after the war. One of the many Europeans who had come to America in the late 1940s with mysterious wealth and vague backgrounds. "I'd be happy to help, Mrs. Ashford. When would be convenient?" "Tomorrow morning, if possible. I'm eager to settle his affairs." The urgency in her voice was subtle, but Tom's trained ear caught it. After 40 years of reading people, he knew when someone was hiding something. The Ashford mansion was impressive, Greek Revival architecture with massive columns and manicured gardens. Margaret herself was elegant, silver-haired with the bearing of Southern aristocracy. Heinrich kept most of his collection in the climate-controlled rooms downstairs, she explained, leading Tom through marble hallways lined with portraits. He was very particular about preservation. The basement was unlike any private collection Tom had seen. Professional museum lighting, humidity controls, custom display cases. This wasn't a hobbyist's collection. This was a systematic archive, and that's when Tom's FBI instincts kicked in. The pieces were extraordinary. 16th century German silver, Baroque religious artifacts, medieval manuscripts, Renaissance paintings. Each item was museum quality, perfectly preserved, and worth a fortune. But something was wrong. Tom had seen thousands of authentic antiques. Real pieces carried the weight of their age. Tiny imperfections, oxidation patterns, wear marks that told their stories. These pieces were too perfect, as if they had been stored in controlled conditions for centuries. More suspicious was the documentation. Every piece had detailed provenance papers, all meticulously typed, all dating from 1947 to 1949. No earlier records, no family histories, no auction houses mentioned. "Mrs. Ashford," Tom said carefully, "these provenance documents, they're all from just after the war. Do you have any earlier records?" Margaret's composed demeanor flickered. Heinrich was very thorough about documentation when he acquired them. I believe he purchased everything around that time. Tom nodded, but his mind was racing. The timeline was too convenient. 1947 to 1949 was exactly when stolen Nazi artifacts were flooding the market, sold by fleeing war criminals or recovered from bombed museums with forged papers. Tom was examining a 15th-century silver chalice when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the base, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, were tiny scratched numbers. KZB 44,391. KZ was short for Konzentrationslager, concentration camp. The numbers were inventory marks used by Nazis to catalog stolen Jewish artifacts. Tom's hands shook slightly as he set the chalice down. This wasn't just suspicious anymore. This was evidence of war crimes. He continued his examination with new eyes. A Baroque painting had similar markings hidden under the frame. A medieval manuscript had a small stamp partially scraped away, but Tom could still make out part of it. für Jüdische, Museum für Jüdische Geschichte. The Jewish History Museum in Berlin, ransacked by Nazis in 1943. Tom excused himself to use the bathroom, but instead pulled out his phone and did a quick search. Heinrich Ashford, born Heinrich Aschoff in Bavaria, 1920. Immigrated to Charleston in 1948. No military records found, but when Tom searched Heinrich Aschoff, he found something that made him sick. SS Obersturmführer Heinrich Aschoff, wanted war criminal. Last seen fleeing Berlin in 1945 with several crates of cultural artifacts looted from Jewish families and museums. Tom stood in the marble bathroom of a Charleston mansion, staring at the phone, realizing he was in the home of a Nazi war criminal's widow, surrounded by stolen Holocaust artifacts worth millions. Tom returned to the basement, his mind working frantically. Margaret was organizing papers, probably the same forged documents that had allowed Heinrich to sell pieces over the decades. "Mrs. Ashford," Tom said quietly, "we need to talk." She looked up, and for the first time he saw fear in her eyes. "These pieces, they're not legally acquired antiques. They're stolen Holocaust artifacts. Your husband was Heinrich Aschoff, wasn't he?" Margaret's composure cracked completely. She sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of her 89 years. I didn't know. Not at first. Heinrich told me he rescued these pieces from bombed museums. He said he was preserving history. When did you find out the truth? Years later. I found his real papers hidden in the safe. By then we were married. We had built a life here. I didn't know what to do. Tom sat across from Margaret, his FBI training taking over. "Mrs. Ashford, your husband didn't work alone. There was a network. Who else was involved?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. There were others. German families who came to Charleston around the same time. They all had collections. They all had new names. How many? 6 families, maybe 7. They stayed in touch, traded pieces sometimes. Heinrich called them his Charleston Circle. Tom's mind was racing. 7 Nazi war criminals had established themselves in Charleston after the war, bringing stolen artifacts worth hundreds of millions. They had lived respectable lives for 80 years, while Jewish families around the world mourned lost heirlooms they would never recover. Are any of them still alive? 2, I think. Hans Müller, he goes by Henry Miller now, lives on Kiowa Island, and Klaus Weber, now Charles Weber. They're both in their late 90s. Tom faced an impossible situation. He was a retired FBI agent, not an active investigator. But he was also possibly the only person alive who could identify these stolen artifacts and connect them to their rightful owners. "Mrs. Ashford, I need to contact the FBI. These pieces need to be returned to their families." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. I've lived with this guilt for decades. Heinrich died 5 years ago, and I've been too afraid to do anything." "Why call me? Why now?" "Because my attorney told me you used to work art crimes for the FBI. I hoped you would know what to do." Tom realized Margaret hadn't been trying to sell stolen artifacts. She'd been trying to find someone who could help her return them. Tom called his former supervisor at the FBI art crime team. Within hours, agents were on planes to Charleston. The Ashford collection was one of the largest recoveries of Nazi-looted art in decades. But it was just the beginning. Using Heinrich's hidden records, they traced the other members of the Charleston Circle. Hans Miller's oceanfront mansion was filled with stolen paintings. Klaus Weber had hoarded Jewish religious artifacts in a climate-controlled warehouse. Each discovery led to more names, more locations, more stolen treasures that had been hiding in plain sight for 80 years. The most emotional part came months later. Tom watched as FBI agents returned a silver menorah to Sarah Goldman, a Holocaust survivor in New York whose family had lost everything in Kristallnacht. "My grandmother lit this every Friday," Sarah said, holding the menorah with shaking hands. "I never thought I'd see it again." A Baroque painting was returned to the descendants of the Rothschild family. Medieval manuscripts went back to the rebuilt Jewish Museum in Berlin. Piece by piece, a small part of what the Nazis had stolen was being returned to its rightful place. The Charleston case made international headlines. Nazi art ring discovered after 80 years. The investigation expanded to other cities, other families, other hidden collections. Tom found himself back in the world he thought he'd left behind, consulting on cases, identifying pieces, helping families recover their heritage. "How did you know?" a reporter asked him during a press conference. 40 years of experience, Tom replied. "Real antiques tell their stories honestly. These pieces were too perfect, too clean. They were hiding their true history." Margaret Ashford became a key witness in the investigation. Despite her age, she testified about everything she knew, helping authorities track down the remaining network members. "I can't undo what Heinrich did," she told Tom, "but I can make sure these families get their belongings back." The revelation destroyed the Ashford family name in Charleston society, but Margaret seemed relieved. "I've been carrying this secret for so long," she said. "It feels good to finally tell the truth." 2 years later, Tom was still working cases. His shop had become an unofficial headquarters for Holocaust artifact recovery. Families would bring him pieces, hoping he could authenticate them and trace their origins. "Mr. Sterling," a young woman said, entering his shop with a small wooden box. "My grandmother left me this before she died. She said it was important, but she never told me why." Tom opened the box and found a collection of photographs, documents, and a small silver locket. Inside the locket was an inscription in Hebrew. "Your grandmother was very wise to save these," Tom told her. "This locket belonged to your great-great-grandmother. It was taken during the Holocaust, but somehow your grandmother got it back." Tom's work had returned over $200 million worth of stolen artifacts to their rightful owners. But the numbers didn't matter as much as the moments, like watching elderly survivors hold family heirlooms they thought were lost forever. "Every piece has a story," Tom would tell visitors to his shop. "My job is to make sure those stories get told to the right people." The FBI officially reopened their Charleston investigation as a permanent unit. Tom consulted part-time, training younger agents to spot the signs of looted art and forged provenance. 5 years after the discovery, Tom received a letter from Sarah Goldman's granddaughter. "Mr. Sterling, I wanted you to know that my grandmother passed away peacefully last month. She was holding the menorah you helped return to her. She said it made her feel connected to her family again. Thank you for bringing her home." Tom kept the letter on his desk, next to photos of other families reunited with their heritage. He had thought retirement would be quiet, simple. Instead, he had found his most important work in the twilight of his career. Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. Sometimes it takes someone with the right eyes to see through decades of lies and bring truth to light. And sometimes, an antique appraiser is exactly what justice needs. And so, in a Charleston antique shop, it was once again proven that expertise and integrity can uncover even the darkest secrets. A man who seemed like a simple antique dealer was actually one of the FBI's most experienced art crimes investigators, and his quiet eye for detail brought justice to families who had waited 80 years for their stolen heritage to come home. Real heroes are like this. They retire from the spotlight, but never retire from doing what's right. They use their knowledge not for profit, but for justice. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe stories like this should continue to be told, support Echo Stories by subscribing. See you in the next video. And remember, Sometimes the most important discoveries happen not in grand museums, but in quiet shops where someone still remembers how to tell truth from lies.